I spent a lot of time with liars, along with the other sins going on here. And I found that the people who were most inclined to lie and lie the hardest and firmest were the respectable people, the people who actually had the most to lose. You never saw those kind of accounts. So that's, I'd like to point that out, because sometimes there is an assumption that just because you do not live a respectable life, somehow you are not honest, and that is not always the case.
Okay, good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining this event in the American Inspiration Author Series. I'm Margaret Talcott, the series producer and director of literary programs at American Ancestors New England Historic Genealogical Society, also part of its Brew Family Learning Center. It's great to have you with us tonight in the land of history, exploring New York City in the Jazz Age, the dazzling lives of some men and women back then. We're delighted to be in partnership with the GBH Forum Network for this presentation. On your screen is the schedule for our hour-long event featuring author Debby Applegate and moderator John Matteson. Before we get started, of course, the real pleasure comes from reading tonight's featured book. Debby Applegate's just released biography, Madam, the book, can be purchased through our partners at Porter Square Books in Cambridge, Mass. Use the code AMINS20 as you order, and the book you receive will be signed by Debby Applegate. Madam is for anyone who loves New York, who follows the history of women. It's comprised of great stories and revelations about leisure time, from Broadway to boxing, the gatherings portrayed in The Great Gatsby, Guys and Dolls, and at the Algonquin Round Table. I really appreciated and enjoyed this picture window into history and culture. Now, briefly, about our speakers this evening. Debby Applegate is an historian and biographer based in Connecticut. Her first book was The Most Famous Man in America, the biography of Henry Ward Beecher. It won the 2007 Pulitzer Prize for biography and was a finalist for the Los Angeles Times Book Prize and the National Book Critics Circle Award for biography. We were fortunate to host Debby in the American Inspiration Series last March in conversation with historian John Matteson about his book about the Civil War. Today, John is returning the favor, the honor, and serving as our moderator. He is Distinguished Professor of English at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. In addition to his recent book, A Worse Place Than Hell, How the Civil War Battle of Fredericksburg Changed a Nation, John also authored The Lives of Margaret Fuller and Eden's Outcasts, a biography of Louisa May Alcott, which was awarded the Pulitzer Prize in biography. He will join us shortly, but for now, welcome, Debby. I feel I really know this book, and with it, the jazz era so well. I've also enjoyed, Debby, the fabulous reviews you've gotten, particularly that jazzy TV segment on CBS Sunday Morning. That had really amazing footage. We are going to put the link to that in the chat, and you all should take a look at some point. I also really love the New York Times Book Review podcast with Pamela Paul. She is special, and what she's doing with those podcasts is great. I can't wait to hear more from you tonight. So welcome, and Debby, take it away.
Well, thank you, Margaret. Thank you to everyone who's making this possible. I loved doing this in March, and I just love your organization in general. I admire what you guys do so much, and of course, WGBH, always the flagship of all public television. I am a little abashed to be here. It's a very dirty subject compared to my last book. My last book was a story of the Beecher family, of Henry Ward Beecher in particular, who now is best remembered perhaps as the little brother of Harriet Beecher Stowe, the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin. They were a grand old New England family with much gravitas and quite serious subject. Probably would have been a better topic. This one is about a madam. It was a big decision to move from ministers to madams, from would-be saints to unrepentant sinners, and it took me a very long time to do. So I'm going to start with giving just a very brief set of words about who she was, and then I'm going to give you the arc of her career, because most of you are probably too young and too respectable to remember or know who she was. Let's start. If I might ask for the first picture so we can see what she looked like. This is Polly Adler probably at the very peak of her career when she was in Chicago for the Jack Dempsey, Gene Tunney, great big boxing championship fight, a very famous fight in which you can see she is wearing her grandest jewels. That's at least 7 bracelets you see there and many diamonds. Polly was more than a madam. She was even more than Manhattan's most famous madam, until we get to, say, the Happy Hooker of the 1970s and the Mayflower Madam of the 1980s. She was more than that. She was, as one journalist put it, one of the authentic big shots in Manhattan throughout the Jazz Age, and a critical behind-the-scenes power broker at a time when New York City was the most powerful city in the world. Polly's speakeasy with a harem, as she liked to call it, was more than an oasis of illicit sex. Her Manhattan brothel was also an impromptu salon of sorts, where the lowbrow and the highbrow mingled. As she herself put it, from the parlor of my house, I had a backstage 3-way view. I could look into the underworld, the half world, and the high. If you can maybe switch to the next one so you can see. In fact, it did not all go as well as she hoped, but it went as well as anyone ever could imagine for a young girl from a shtetl who came to the United States as a very poor, uneducated young girl. Slumming intellectuals, Broadway bohemians, and newspaper reporters were fascinated by her. They loved her humor, her realism, her lightly loose wisecracks. Many in the underground gay community, both male and female, found her parlor a retreat where they could relax and be themselves. Executives in the new fields of radio, motion pictures, and advertising employed her girls to woo their clients. Wall Street traders passed along stock tips on the way to the bedroom. Racketeers and bootleggers used her parlor as an informal headquarters where they could confer with politicians and judges away from prying eyes. Gamblers found it a safe haven for high-stakes games, and everyone, from Park Avenue aristocrats to Lower East Side hooligans, appreciated her ironclad discretion. She was arrested dozens of times over the course of her 25-year career, but that only fed her reputation as a purveyor of underworld chic. As for Polly, she liked to call herself a modern Horatio Alger hero. As she once put it, this is a quote, "A cynical person might say my life has been a typical American success story. From the arrival at Ellis Island, up the ladder rung by rung, $5 a week, $10 a week, $100 a week, a mink coat, a better address, from neighborhood trade to an international clientele, from a nobody to a legend." So here we see this is a picture of the town where she was born. No one is born a whore, Polly once said. This is tough language. She most certainly was not. Pearl Adler, as she was named by her parents, she was what she called a good Jewish girl. She was born in 1900, more or less, in a small town in the Pale of Russia in what is now Belarus. She was, wait, let's hold on. We're still in her early childhood before we get to her teen years where things went a little darker. She was, if I might tip my hat to John Matteson's great book on Margaret Fuller, she was a Margaret Fuller kind of girl. She was unusually intelligent. She was a confident, extremely confident oldest daughter who was raised by her father as if she were a son. She was passionate about education and eager to shake off the confines of village life and to see the world, to make something of herself. her family supported her ambitions, which was very unusual for a girl of this era. But as the old Yiddish saying goes, man plans and God laughs. When Polly was 13, the year she is before, I keep gesturing to the pictures and nobody can see me. In 1914, she was 14 years old. When she was 13 years old, her father decided she wasn't going to go to school. Instead, he was going to send her to America. She would be the first member of the family, and they would all go over in installments, and the rest of the family would follow in the next coming months. But the problem was, she lands in Ellis Island in 1913 in December. She is sent to stay with friends of her father's in Springfield, Massachusetts. But then tragedy strikes. Before her parents could immigrate, World War I broke out, cutting off all travel from Russia and leaving Polly stranded in the United States, living among strangers. She was forced to quit school and take a job in one of Springfield's paper factories. You can see that the picture right before this, where she's in that little white dress. She's rented that white dress for her graduation photo from junior high school, and she will never go to school again throughout the rest of her career. Until the very end. She is making a mere $3 a week. She's working 9 hours a day, 6 days a week. She's miserable and she's poor and she's lonely. So finally, she decides to hell with this. She's 15 years old. She decides to try her luck in Brooklyn, New York, where she has some cousins. So here you can see this is this picture of her in Coney Island is right after she has arrived in Brooklyn. She has clearly already progressed from being the good little schoolgirl to she's trying to dress like the movie idol Theda Bara, who she looked a little like. Some of you might remember Theda Bara from the movie The Vamp, who was one of the first sex symbols in Hollywood. She doesn't have any more education, any more skills or money than she had before, but in Brooklyn, she has freedom. She throws herself into the delights of Coney Island, into the ragtime dance halls of Brooklyn and the promenade of Pitkin Avenue. You can see she clearly loves teenage culture. Even if she doesn't have parents, at least she has that kind of freedom. But the problem is there are reasons people are warned against young girls spending time in Coney Island and dance halls, and she becomes proof of that. She was cagey about how she makes this transition from being a Coney Island jazz baby to becoming a madam. Most people are sort of cagey about that transition. There were traumas along the way. When she was 17, she was raped and impregnated by her boss. She underwent an illegal abortion. Then she lost her job and she was kicked out of her house by her cousins. And yet still that's still hard, I think, to explain and to understand this transition from good girl to the sex trades for anyone who has not really experienced that sort of poverty and loneliness, that those feelings of powerlessness and hopelessness. But suffice to say, many young women in her position shared this feeling that she had, that at some point, the decision to start selling sex seems like the only one that is going to work for her. It's going to be a quick path to a glamorous new life filled with cash, pretty clothes, and camaraderie. It frankly starts to feel like the business of sex is a sign of being smart, of taking care of yourself, maybe even a badge of honesty in a rotten world that really doesn't care about you. Polly opens her first brothel in 1920. I think you can switch to the next. There you are. This is her right after she has opened her brothel. It's a 2-bedroom apartment right across from Columbia University. This is the same year that Prohibition takes effect. She says it's just going to be for a little while until she can make enough money to quit and open her own business. And in fact, she does start making money like crazy. The amount of money she's being paid is 5, 6, 7 times more than she was making as a seamstress. And in fact, she does open a dress shop right a little bit right after this picture was taken. But the problem is running a legitimate business is also very hard, and it doesn't have the high profit margins that she'd gotten used to. In an era when the average man made a little over $3,000 a year and most women made half of that, she was soon pulling in about $60,000 annually, the equivalent of a little less than $1 million in today's money. And she has power over her circumstances in a way that she never had before. So after 2 years in dressmaking, going back into legitimate life, she decides to hell with it again. She's going to go back into the flesh trades in 1923. And this is really the big turning point. She's taken up, I should have put in a picture of some of her gambler and gangster pals here because they are critical to her new career. She's taken up by Arnold Rothstein, who is known as the king of the Jewish underworld, and the guy who got most of the big bootleggers of New York City started in their underworld careers. For sports fans, he is famous from, you may even remember this from The Great Gatsby, for fixing the 1919 World Series. If you are a fan of musical theater, you might know his Rothstein's secret floating crap games inspired the Smash Broadway musical Guys and Dolls. He introduces her to the underworld, including rising big shots like Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, Bugsy Siegel, Legs Diamond, and her house quickly becomes a sort of favorite hotspot for the bookies and up-and-coming bootleggers. All of this makes Polly more ambitious. You can move on and we'll see. You can see already, by the way, that picture of her on the rock with her pals, that those girls worked for her, and one of them was also her partner in the dressmaking business. So she opens her first major Broadway, right here. You can see it's the brick building, the very unassuming brick building. The building right next to it is the Harding Hotel, which was known as a nest of bootleggers and ladies of the night, and had several murders right there under its canopy. She, by this point, opening this brothel on 45th Street, right in the center of the Speakeasy District, makes her a little like, if you will, the Forrest Gump of the Roaring Twenties. All of a sudden, her house becomes this hotspot for all kinds of the cultural influencers, as we would say today, who are starting to make the 20s what we now remember as this cultural fermentation. She becomes deeply involved in the world of Broadway, Hollywood, the Friars Club, and Tin Pan Alley. She's friends with many of the great entertainers and musicians of the time, especially the jazz musicians. She hires Duke Ellington and Fats Waller to play at her parties all the time. She entertains many of the big athletes in the golden era of sports, including Jack Dempsey and later on Joe DiMaggio. She becomes the favorite hostess of the Yankee Stadium and Madison Square Garden crowds. By the time she moves in 1924, by the time she's settling into this building right here, her brothel has become the hot after-hours clubhouse for the adventurous writers, actors, and playwrights who gather at the Algonquin Round Table for lunch, the Algonquin Hotel for lunch. People like Dorothy Parker, Robert Benchley, and George S. Kaufman. You can see here, this is her very first fur coat. She talks quite a lot about that. The fur coat was the sign that you had really made it in the world back then, and especially in the underworld. The coat is so big that it almost swallows her up. The stamp of approval of all these cultural influencers gives her an in with the big money men of Madison Avenue, Park Avenue, and Wall Street. She soon counted Jock Whitney, Winthrop Rockefeller, some of the Vanderbilt boys as customers and friends. She becomes the leading provider of what we would call, or what called at the time, and we may still call, professional party girls for politicians and expense account men who rely on easy women to grease the wheels of commerce and political power. You can go ahead and scoot forward, and you can see she's living it up. She loves to dance, so she has just won a Charleston contest right here. She was very proud of this cup. She saved it to the end of her life. She becomes Arnold Rothstein introduces her to the army of crooked police and politicians that he keeps in his pocket. She became known for her generous bribes to the Vice Squad and her wild parties where gangsters mingle with politicians and judges. New York's Playboy mayor, Jimmy Walker, still one of the most famous mayors in New York history, was one of her most valued customers. One critic summed up the charges against Polly this way: she provided a liaison between the underworld the politics, professions, big business, and desirable women. Judges' tips were bartered in her plush parlor. Labor bosses formulated deals there. Police officers were broken or made, and candidates for public office gained or lost party support as a result of conferences held at Polly's place. And I should say the most shocking moment in all of my research was in talking to an elderly man who had known Polly when he was young, who said that Polly told him near the end of his life Polly told him near the end of her life, when she already had cancer, that Franklin Delano Roosevelt had been a customer of hers. This is around the time that he was running for governor, and that when he ran for president, she was approached to make sure that she stayed silent, and in fact received payments for the rest of her life to ensure her silence. She's riding high when the crash comes and the depression sets in. All of a sudden the mood changes, and people are no longer so tolerant of the bootleggers and the crooked politicians and the crooked cops. So she gets swept up in the municipal scandals that arise in the 1930s. Whether or not Roosevelt was a client of Polly's, he was very much on her radar when he was preparing to run for president in 1932. So now her notoriety is a liability. She's swept up by the press, who make her nationally famous. They call her the female Al Capone, the first lady of the underworld, but she was wilier than most of them. She managed to stay out of jail, even when many of her colleagues did go to jail. She managed to be in the limelight and yet somehow still survive. She does not go to prison until 1935, when she's swept up in the hunt for Dutch Schultz, who has been using her house as a hideout. Her trial causes a media frenzy. I think we may have a picture here coming up of her. There we are, right there. You can see where she's been arrested and is cursing at the photographers, covering her face. She ends up going to jail for 30 days and gets 5 days off for good behavior. After she gets out, it turns out, much as she's humiliated by this and broke from it, her fame has only gained her more fans. Some of her best years are in the late 30s, when she becomes the madam to cafe society, catering to the people of the 21 Club and the Stork Club. But eventually, and she lasts all the way through World War II, through the Fat Cat years. But by 1945, she's 45 years old. The times have changed. She is ready to get out. So she starts looking for an exit plan. She had been asked at different points, would she consider writing a memoir? She, of course, said, no, are you kidding? That I might make some money off of it, but that would just about pay for my funeral. But by 1945, times have changed. Many of the people who might have objected are now in the grave or in prison. And so she decides, why not? Why not see if I can redeem myself by writing a book? She starts working on a book. In this case, you can see a picture of her with Virginia Faulkner, the woman kneeling, the heavy-set woman kneeling there, and she starts working on her memoir around 1945. But it takes a long time. It's not easy to write a book, and her book is rejected by every publisher in New York because she is just too hot a potato to hold. But finally, she retires. She does retire, though, and keeps working on the book. She goes to California. She goes back to high school. She enrolls in junior college. And here you can see the picture of her with her parents, who she's brought over from the old country. And finally, in 1953, she finds a publisher who agrees to publish A House Is Not a Home. It is a smash success. She sells 2 million copies. She's on the New York Times bestseller list. It's whitewashed, of course. There's a lot she couldn't tell, but it had a major impact in 1950s culture, equal to the other big authors of 1953, Alfred Kinsey, Hugh Hefner, and Simone de Beauvoir. She shakes up the 1950s. When she dies, of lung cancer in 1962. Long, respectful obituaries appear across the country. She is hailed as a symbol of a decadent, long gone era. And of course, it's worth mentioning as an author, and I'm sure John will agree, publishing a best-selling book really boosts your legacy. As the journalist Harry Golden observed, after all of Polly's corruption of both men and women, when she cashed in her chips, what did the obituary read? Of course, author dies. So there's a million things more to say, but I will end here now and welcome John here to ask some questions that I hope do not shock the audience. That's the best I can hope for.
Oh, let's shock the heck out of him, Debbie. My gosh, throw caution to the winds with this one. Thank you so much for wanting to have me on, and thank you too for giving us all such a really great, extraordinary book. I hope it's not too unprofessional of me just to say, wow. I'm really very impressed, and I know how hard you worked on it and how long. And as a fellow biographer, I kind of feel like I have to start talking a little bit of shop, because this was not an easy book to write for a lot of reasons. One that jumps out is that this is a portrait of the American criminal underworld, which is chock full of people who would not last very long if they had made a habit out of being truthful. So against this backdrop of double dealing and deception and cloak and dagger, how do you research and tell a true story?
Well, you of course, that's the part that I like. The writing part is the lousy part. So how do I do it? By letting myself go for too long and not reining myself in. I should say, just as a caveat, I'm very sensitive about lying. Over time, I spent a lot of time with liars, along with the other sins going on here. And I found that the people who were most inclined to lie and lie the hardest and firmest were the respectable people, the people who actually had the most to lose. You never saw those kind of accounts. So that's, I like to point that out, because sometimes there is an assumption that just because you do not live a respectable life, somehow you are not honest, and that is not always the case. The other thing I would say, counterintuitively, is that when you have contact with the criminal world, when you are a criminal and you have contact with the law, you are actually very well recorded. So it turned out there were extraordinary resources in law enforcement. There were her docket books that listed many of her arrests. I couldn't read all of them because some of them, she changed her name, but I spent a long time with them. There were FBI files. There were reports from crime reporters. There were immigration reports when, for example, her brother is almost deported because he becomes a thief. So there were a lot more than you might think, actually far more than if she had just been an ordinary housewife than I might have found. But then the other thing was, because I want to say this because I love genealogists. I am not a genealogist. I think I'm a crackerjack researcher, but genealogy is its own world, as anyone here will at this place can tell you. And I had three glorious blessings from the gods. One was I found I also love junk dealers and people who don't throw things away. I found Polly's what was left of the things that she saved. She saved 2 trunks of keepsakes, of scrapbooks, photos, programs from things that she had attended, little things like the T-shirt she wore when she came over on the boat in 1913, her first dancing shoes. All of those were saved for years. She had reel-to-reel tapes that she made, her drafts of her books. Unfortunately, her brother, the last remaining Adler to be alive of her generation, inherited everything and was so embarrassed by her profession, he threw almost all of it away. Some of it will turn up, I hope, but I had the core of what was left. I had her photos, I had some of her papers. That made a huge difference. I also had the papers of her ghostwriter, Virginia Faulkner, which were found in a building that was being torn down and saved by the guy who was tearing them down, who, as he pointed out, is often made fun of by his family for taking home junk from things. And it was a thrill for us both to be able to say how valuable these were. And then the last thing, speaking of the genealogy, I found a cousin of Polly's who became a great friend of mine, who was in the course of becoming a master genealogist. And she was able to find extraordinary items using ancestry and all the tremendous tools that genealogists have without, and also put me in touch with cousins who, for the most part, did not remember as much about her because they were not allowed to talk about her because their parents refused to talk about their cousin, the criminal. But that made all the difference in the world. Researching it was a delight.
It's really interesting to think about this woman who, on the one hand, has to be so hard-boiled, but on the other hand, really is kind of a sentimentalist. You know, he keeps scrapbooks and photos and so forth. You know, she's got this softer side as well.
Absolutely. And in fact, some of that does not, it's hard to make that come across because I know, she was somebody who committed a lot of crime. She did lure young women into lives that were not healthy. She did corrupt more cops and politicians we could possibly count. Even if all those people were already slightly corrupted, she added to that. But still, she tried to be a fair boss. She tried to be an honorable person. There is a phrase in the criminologists use called the villain's paradox, that the problem is if you're a villain, the only people you have to collaborate are with other villains who are not trustworthy. So finding somebody you can trust in the underworld is probably the hardest thing you can do. But in that world, Polly was a villain that villains could trust, as did lots of respectable people.
Yeah. And something that really jumps out of your book, which is wonderful, is that these underworld figures don't just turn into a wash of stereotypic, riffraff crooks. They have personality. They have individuality. There's a long way from Dutch Schultz, who comes across kind of as a prince among men, and somebody like Pretty Amberg, who is horrific.
Well, I'm not going to go exactly with Prince Among Men, since he
Well,
was
as
actually
compared
known as
to-
a sociopath. But by comparison to the guy who invented the sack murder, he sure is. He was
A homicidal prince among men. Yes.
Exactly. Well, and in that too, Damon Runyon is no longer as fashionable as he used to be. Although I love Damon Runyon's stories. He's the basis for the musical Guys and Dolls. They're hilarious, and one of the things that makes them so funny is that these characters, they are characters, they do have personality, and frankly, most of this generation, it still remains true that the people who are most likely to get caught in crime if in the immigrant world are not the older people, the parents who come over, and it's not the kids who are born in the United States to the immigrant parents. It's these ones who are kind of caught in the middle, who maybe were kids when they came over, like Lucky Luciano or like Meyer Lansky, who are not, they're so smart, but they have no education. They have not a chance in the world to make something of themselves. And so they become bitter and cynical, and they say, well, this is America. Listen, if I have enough in America, if you have enough money, you can buy respectability. And that is pretty true, actually. I see there's a question here, I noticed, sorry, in the chat box. Maybe that's your question. Did she ever make, because we're on the subject, did she ever make charitable donations to the needier, to worthwhile organizations? And I should say that, like a lot of women of the evening, she was, as you say, very sentimental, and many of them were very fond of children, because many of them had to give up their children or had to have abortions. So she often donated to Jewish orphanages in particular. That was one of her things, although she also was somewhat bitter about that, because more than once, when she tried to make a donation, it was turned away because they did not want her name associated with the organization.
Wow. The book actually made me think of works by other Jewish immigrants, like Yezierska's Bread Givers and Abraham Kahan's Rise of David Levinsky. these stories of people who are seeking prosperity in a strange land have to make compromises and yet always have their traditions and their inherited values kind of sitting on their shoulder. And another question in the chat was, how did her family feel about this? But we also need to think, right, about how she regarded her Jewishness and the moral strictures that background would have placed upon her, and also her immigrant background, that status.
She was she was educated when she was back in the Pale of Russia by a rabbi. That was who was preparing her for her exams, because she was going to go to Pinsk to go to school before she took a wrong way and turn and went to the United States. And she was very proud of her education, especially since girls at the time were not really taught Hebrew. In fact, later on, there's a moment where one of the reporters is sort of saying, how good could this be? The yeshiva girl who becomes a madam, and she proves it. She takes it out and she writes a little Hebrew for him. At the same time, she was also extremely saddened by this. When her parents, she brought over her entire family, paid for them to come to the United States, and supported them pretty much entirely. She also sent money to her relatives in Israel, and her parents actually lived in Israel for a little while. But when her parents found out what she did for a living after everything blows up in the press in the 1930s, they were deeply ashamed of her. They still kept their ties to her. They still took her money, but they would not have her at the Seder table. They would not have her for the high holidays meals, and it broke her heart. And in fact, that story that she tells, that I told of her telling this young man at the end of her life that she knew FDR, that FDR had been one of her customers, comes about because she has just had the double whammy of her book, the contract from her book that she thought she had in hand being pulled once again because of the notorious Polly Adler name, and her parents saying they wouldn't have her at the Seder table. And I think that moment, one of the reasons, even though I could not prove definitively that FDR was one of her customers, one of the things that gives me the instinct that it is true, and there was a lot of circumstantial evidence that it absolutely could be true, was that feeling that she was saying it. She only said it once, never came up again. No, it was just that one time, almost as if like a cry of pain to say, I am somebody who people thought was important, that respectable people respected.
Yeah, and I'd love to come back to that desire that just drives and almost defines her to be somebody. And one of the things that we recognize as biographers is the conflicted ambition, the conflicted desire. And she wants to be well known in a sense, but she's in this profession that demands that she be obscure. So how did she finesse that, and how do you think about it?
Well, how did she finesse it? I'll tell you, the double standard helps a lot. She made a point of wooing reporters. She knew tons of the big editors, and Walter Winchell, a name that may be familiar to some people in the audience, was one of her steadiest and most enthusiastic clients. And what's funny is Walter Winchell does not mention her in his columns until she gets famous because of the scandals. And after that, she is steadily in all the big gossip columns, and there's tons of gossip columns. This is the golden age of gossip. She parades her girls through nightclubs and speakeasies as a sort of walking billboard because she can't advertise. And yet somehow, and of course, keeping the cops on your string, keeping politicians. She did not blackmail. She swears she never blackmailed anyone, but there is always that vague threat of blackmail. So I think one of the things she did, how she handled that, was she wanted to be notorious. She just wanted everyone who might use that against her to somehow be in her debt. a little. Is that, you want to take me down? I'm not afraid to name names. And there are points at which, when FDR is governor of New York, he is getting calls from as far away as Washington, D.C. saying, you've got to do something about this Polly Adler, because and in fact, there's a point at which Huey Long is one of her customers, and you can see like all she'd like to do is ride that coattail.
And in spite of her criminality, she was a good boss, wasn't she?
Well, that's what she says, and I do believe
fair.
but I do that she did like in her FBI files. Hoover, J. Edgar Hoover, really wants to try to bring her down at one point, not I think personally, but because I think he wants to know what she knows, because he himself was something of a blackmailer, and they're interviewing all of these pimps and all of these prostitutes from across the country, saying, well, has she ever violated the Mann Act? You can't transport women across state lines for immoral purposes, and they all say, oh no, are you kidding? Women come from across the country to come work for her because they've heard she's such a good boss, and you'll make a ton of money, and it'll be fair. She hated pimps, she hated drug addicts. So I do think she was fair. She felt like, listen, if the world is going to pay for this, they might as well pay me, and it might as well be as safe and honorable as I can possibly make it. I see in the questions, I see one more about why wasn't she deported? And she, at the end of her life, after she publishes her book, in fact, the FBI is so furious because she had a big book party at the 21 Club that was covered in all the papers, that they sick the FBI and the Naturalization Service on her. But somehow, she does not say how she manages to kill that. It's not at all clear, but it's quite clear that something happens, and it's the decision to deport her just disappears.
She was also a pretty fair psychologist. In fact, if you'll permit me, I'd love to read not quite a full paragraph that I really like. It's from your chapter, The Double Standard, and it says, Polly was learning to notice the subtle signs of what pleased a customer, what cooled him off, what flattered him. Men sought out prostitutes for more than sexual relief, she soon realized. They came to assuage loneliness or massage their egos, for relaxation, male camaraderie, or compensation for life's disappointments, for the taste of power, or for the relief of letting down their public defenses with someone who wouldn't judge them. Was a fellow looking for an actress to convince him that he was a red-hot Romeo? Or did he get off on the knowledge that a woman was submitting to him against her own desires? Did he want novelty or familiarity? Did he want his wildest fantasies indulged, or a sympathetic ear? I love that because it adds another dimension to this entire story.
Well, and she was probably a more canny psychologist than me, because one of the things that took so long, besides having to reorient myself from Calvinist ministers to Jewish criminals, I had to get. What were all these respectable people doing? What's Desi Arnaz, as someone asked? Yes. What were all these politicians? What were these people who, really were the pinnacles of respectability in some cases? What were they doing? And this was the question. I know this sounds idiotic, but I was like, if you want to run around and have sex as much as you want, why get married? And if you want to be married, then what do you want to run around and be constantly putting your marriage in danger for? And I'm an idiot, because it took me like 2 years of thinking about this and finally thinking, oh, wait, humans, we just want to eat our cake and have it too. Like, I don't know how it took me so long. So that paragraph you just read, I actually worked on for a long time, because I was like, I don't know how to convey the complexity of something that's actually so simple. And you'll notice also that there were a lot of things that I learned that I didn't necessarily have the exact, somebody saying it. So there's sometimes I move into passive voice in my phrasing, so that you can get the idea without me, as if somebody has said it who's not me. And in fact, every once in a while, the line editor at Doubleday said, hey, can't we move this into the active voice? And I would say, no, because then it will be a lie. I'm implying. I'm implying.
That's cool. So we've really kind of hit the point where we really want to bring in some questions from our audience. You've been great, Debbie, about already folding some of these in. So I may still be bouncing back
Sure,
between
sure.
the chat and what's on my mind. But we have this question that just came up. Did her memoir mention famous people who subsequently or consequently denied that they knew her? There's also a question which you sort of answered, was Desi Arnaz one of her clients? And the answer is yes.
Well, it dovetails with that the first question, because one of the things also I had, I mean, really, clearly the muses wanted this project to be written. I don't know why they wanted me to take 13 years, but they did want me to, because it was like a drug. I would deal out a brand new major fact, and then I'd have to spend another 6 months on it. But one of the things is she had a very powerful agent, a literary agent, and a very powerful lawyer at the end of her life. And they help her with the publication, and all of the papers of her agent are up at Columbia University. She was a woman named Anne Watkins. And so I could go through and look at all the correspondence with all the publishers. And one of the things that's in there is all the correspondence as they're trying to get permission to mention these names. And most of the people she mentions will not sign these, including her own maid, who worked for her for years as her second in command. So that somebody like James Thurber, the humorist James Thurber, who spent eons in her house, spent many nights in her house. She writes, there's actually a letter in his collection that says, I just got a letter from, as if I'm going to allow her to mention my good friend, Jim Thurber. Then, of course, he makes a dirty joke about how some of the other writers for the New Yorker, how much time they spent there. So that there were moments where I started to judge people based on how much of a hypocrite they were. So that somebody like Desi Arnaz, who really was a very good friend of Polly's, he makes no secret of it. He talks about being friends with Polly in his memoir. Somebody like the songwriter Jimmy Van Heusen, who collaborated with Frank Sinatra for many years, makes no bones. He's one of the only Hollywood people who appears at her funeral. And in fact, in general, I suppose it's no surprise, the people in the music world in general, I think, are more free than the people in the Hollywood and Wall Street world. And they were the ones who, and the sports people, the people in sports and music were absolutely fine, saying, of course, she was just part of the mix. She was central to the culture. It's the other ones, the respectable people who are more hypocritical.
Interesting. We have someone who wants to know about Polly's own love life, which, as we know, in the world of prostitution is distinct from one's sexual life. And so did she have romantic liaisons?
It's funny because the editors tell her that you've got to put in something more of your love life. You must have had some love life. She was extremely protective about talking about that. Same as very protective about talking about her family as well. But they do force her to put some stuff into her memoir. She did have one big romance. She had a couple, but she quickly discovers, again, sorry that it's hard to avoid the question of hypocrisy, that she quickly discovers that even people who love her, who want to spend time with her, don't necessarily want to be seen outside of the brothel with her, and they may love her, but they don't want to be married to her. And when she finally does have someone who wants to marry her, she refuses. And I think she doesn't fully explain. I think some of it could be a little like the old Groucho Marx phrase, any club that will have me, I don't want to be a member of. But it could also be, I think she just realized this world that she was in, this life she was leading, was not conducive to a real life. And at the end of her life, she says, she's retired quite well. She lives quite reasonably and a good long life. Well, a long enough life. Everyone dies young in the speakeasy generation. The livers are going, the heart attacks, the lung cancer. Everyone smokes and drinks and parties too much. But she says to a reporter, you know, I can never really be happy because I know too much about human nature, and I can never really be with a man because I'm not a clinging vine, and that's anathema to women or to men.
Yeah, what do you think, Debbie, is the biggest misconception people tend to have about the Jazz Age and the Depression, especially in New York?
Well, what their biggest
Because it's all kind of
misconception.
filtered through Great Gatsby, right?
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. And of course, what's interesting for me is this is a book that's about the underbelly of the underbelly. Like, so if the gangsters have been mythologized, one of the things that was surprising to me is why is she left out of the pantheon of iconic gangsters that arise during this period? So I think one thing is that notable is that The Great Gatsby is actually based on a number of her friends. The character Meyer Wolfsheim is Arnold Rothstein and comes from an occasion when Fitzgerald met him. And who is the great party thrower? She is famous for throwing these mad parties, very Gatsby-like parties where you mix all kinds of people. You have jazz musicians, you have everything you think of as a Gatsby party, she throws. But of course, what is she? She's not the bootleg baron. She's not Jay Gatz. She is the person hired to create the illusion. She's the party planner who pays, and just like all those young girls that are there, they are so often, maybe that is perhaps one of the biggest myths, is how often those flappers, those freewheeling flappers that we all think of as the great first sexual revolution, so often were in fact being paid to provide somebody else's pleasure, that the pleasure did not come without a price.
We have an audience member who wants to know whether any Black clients were friends or patrons of Polly Adler.
She had quite a few friends who were Black in the entertainment world, and she had her maids were always Black, and that sounds pejorative as as an employee situation, and it was, of course, but in fact she had was critical to Black women running her house. She could not have built this empire without them, and she had one in particular, a woman named Showboat, who was nicknamed because of the musical Showboat, written by Edna Ferber at the time, and she was absolutely critical to Polly building her career, and sadly, Showboat at the last minute also would not sign a release. So she is not included in the memoir. And the reason is because she was easily as smart, if not smarter than Polly. And she says, I need to be paid. If you're going to be making money off this book, I need to be paid. And Polly was so tight with the dime that she refused to pay her. And so she just wrote Showboat out. And it's really a shame because you really lose an important aspect of how much Black women were central to the underworld in many ways. And I will say that as far as whether they were customers, in general, New York City tended to have a color line in brothels unless you were going specifically to a place where you knew you could get something different racially. But she certainly, many of the women who worked for her dated and did sleep with many of the Black entertainers.
And I know that I'm a writer because I was willing to accept a lot of the vice until we get to the part of your book where she's written her memoir and she stiffs her ghostwriter and claims all of the work was hers. That was what kind of made me hot under the collar. I don't know how you feel.
No, it is true that her ghostwriter, Virginia Faulkner, is in fact a very, goes on to become a very important editor at the University of Nebraska, a brilliant writer, wonderful person, very much love her. But she did not want her name. Now, she did not want her name associated with it. So in fairness, that was the deal, but it is also true that Polly just lies through her teeth when asked, because this is all she wanted. She wanted the education. She wanted to be a writer. So for her, this is a happy ending, even if she was not entirely happy. about it.
One more audience question in 25 words or less. Are there records of any efforts by Polly to control disease, pregnancy, or violence against women in her employ?
Oh,
Kind of
sure.
an OSHA question.
Oh, yeah. Oh, sure. Absolutely. And in fact, I'll tell you this, I did not know as much about those things as I at the start of this as I did at the end. And even for one thing, we live in a grand era of where pregnancy and sexually transmitted diseases are deeply controlled at this compared to then. Syphilis, I had to learn so much about syphilis. I still think about it all the time, that we had no idea. So she had a doctor who would come in every week to check the girls. She gave away a free condom. I had to learn all about what kind of birth control was available, and she did all of her part to do that. But even still, and she did her part to make sure things were as safe as possible. But that, I guess I should say at the last, our closing point, which is that I thought a lot also about the question of, what should happen with prostitution? Should it be legal? Should it be illegal? I think the problem is, no matter how good a boss she was, how hard we try to think of prostitution as just another job, if we could just regulate it, the problem is it intersects with the deepest, darkest sides of the human psyche. And no matter what you do to make it respectable and clean, it will always be unpredictable and potentially dangerous. And so that always is. It's a dark book, despite there's a lot of humor in it, but it is a dark book for that reason.
Yeah. And the first one, a biography I've seen in a long time that starts with a warning, just about the language. We can't get into that because really it's time to bring Margaret back in. Thank you, Debbie, for just a scintillating discussion.
Thank you,
What
John.
a fascinating conversation, you two. I mean, I learned a tremendous amount reading the book. I read every word. But I
bet you did, Margaret. I bet there's a lot of things you did not know.
I did. I read some passages a few times. So really great book. I thank you both very much. I learned a lot more tonight. As we do for all our American Inspiration author events, we've asked Debbie to share a reading from the book. Oh, yes. So Debbie's picked out a good section. Back to you.
So this is from the very end, and it was very hard to figure out how to end this. Maybe everyone always has this problem. She dies. She's done. So I thought I would just go with the very last two paragraphs. Despite Polly's passionate pursuit of posterity, it was not Polly, but her male criminal colleagues who became 20th century cultural icons. Prohibition's excesses enshrined the gangster as an American archetype, whose lordly ambitions and tragic flaws were considered essential to understanding our national character. But the Scarlet Woman as Horatio Alger tale has never grabbed the American imagination the way the rum runners and the racketeers did. This is in part because sex workers in general, Polly in particular, are dealers in illusion. The illusions of intimate connections between strangers, of desires without limits or consequences, of spontaneous ecstasy on command, and whatever else the human id can dream up and pay for. Polly's mastery of this mysterious art was the source of her significance, and it contributed in no small part to the legends of the Jazz Age. But Americans have little appetite for examining the dreary mechanics behind the spectacle of our dreams. Polly, for all her longing to be known, hid far more of her story than she shared, even from herself. And if she has not received her historical due, it is in part because she is a symbol whose reality contradicts the very myths that make this era so captivating and charismatic. And that, as she would be the first to say, is a hard sell. But do not count her out. As she said near the end of her life, I have always been a fighter, and I hope to Christ I never stop till curtain time. It may be that Polly's story is better suited to this 21st century, when there is a vital interest in exploring the intersections of sex and power, and in dismantling the conspiracies of silence that protect powerful people from bearing the full cost of their desires.
Debbie, thank you. Very resonant reading, and I really appreciate going behind the scenes with these freewheeling flappers and these glamorous books. It's fun. It's fun going in, and it takes a lot of thought being there, though. And that you showed us the gritty underside and made us aware of really what New York was like in its ascendant years at the beginning of the last century is so helpful and so meaningful to all of us. Thank you both for your dialogue. And I do want to remind our audience that copies of Madam are available from Porter Square Books. You can order online using the code AMINTS20 to get a signed copy. They'll be sending out books in early February once they've met up with Debbie's signature. This is truly fun reading for the winter time. Perhaps it's a Valentine gift that you could give. Just a thought. In the spirit of full color and full throttle, we at American Ancestors NEHGS are delighted to have presented tonight's author talk. If you're researching an era, a city, a family, or an individual, as Debbie was, you will find our library and education center useful. We have a slide for that. Our stacks on Newbury Street have limited access now, but they'll soon open up, and NEHGS members can delve into our digital archives anytime to gain access to databases worldwide for genealogy, an international search for madams, potentially. Free to the public, you can chat with one of our genealogists. Our Brew Family Learning Center is hosting many educational programs ahead. Next month, we're doing sessions on researching females in your family. And later in the month, we're offering tips on finding your criminal relatives. And on March 29, Debbie will be back with us. She'll be on a panel with Russell Shorto, another American Inspiration author, and genealogist David Allen Lambert. They'll be in conversation about notorious relatives, researching people and families outside the law. Do come for that, and you can learn all of Debbie's research tricks. More information in that on the chat. And for you literary sorts, which is so many of you, do join us for these free virtual author talks in the American Inspiration series. Upcoming on February 10, we're presenting more glitter and glamour, this time Hollywood style, in the tale of the Mankiewicz family, past and present. Last century, Herman and Joe were the forces behind such celebrated films as Citizen Kane, the Marx Brothers' Monkey Business, and more. All About Eve, the Philadelphia Story, Cleopatra. Today, the Mankiewicz grandson, author Nick Davis, has published the biography Competing with Idiots. Grandson Ben, the host of Turner Classic Movies, will be our moderator. Don't miss these cousins in conversation about their famous grandfather and great uncle, about families and Hollywood. Later in the month, on February 28, we'll hear from author and lawyer Linda Hirschman about her new book, The Color of Abolition. The social historian and best-selling author will discuss the social movement that is abolition, the life and work of William Lloyd Garrison, Frederick Douglass, and Maria Weston Chapman, a socialite of Boston. She'll be joined by Lamerchi Frazier of the Museum of African American History in Boston and in Nantucket. And on March 8, we'll welcome Matt Paxton, former host of A&E's Hoarders, for you, Debbie, Hoarders, and current host of PBS's Legacy List with Matt Paxton. He'll share insights from his new book, Keep It the Memories, Lose the Stuff, Declutter, Downsize, and Move Forward with Your Life, Another Winter Project. Signed copies of this book come with your ticket. So back to tonight, though, truly winding down, we thank you, Debbie and John, for a really wonderful, illuminating evening. You've added so greatly to our understanding of New York. And to our audience, thank you for joining us. From all of us behind the scenes in Boston, New Haven, New York, we wish you a good evening and inspirational reading in these winter months. Stay warm, stay healthy, and do everyone have a good night. Thank you, Debbie and John.
Thank you. Pleasure.
Thank you. What a delight.